Hi and welcome back to MDriven. Today we're going to talk about the new changes to the layout system that will help you to do responsive UI. So I'm starting up with a blank model. I'm going to add a few things just to have something to build a UI for. Suppose that we have a master detail like this. It means nothing currently, it's just a very simple model that we will do a view model for. So we're gonna add view model 1 and say that it's rooted in clause 1 and that it needs a root, and let's just give it a document form layout like that. So having this, we also got a class action to actually show this view model 1 show class over here, but we need a way to create new objects as well. So let's do another UI. And root that in class 1 as well, and take the UI first, seeker outer form. So that will give us a view model to, I'm gonna change the name of this one then. Seek and create, and then I would want to change the name on the action as well. Seek and create. Need to save the model before actually trying to use it. Demo responsive. Having done that, I can just verify that it works with XML. Persistence, and I got up the debugger where I can see that I have no, okay, seek and create. I call it create, but I actually don't have a create action, so I'm gonna add one. No, not a class action. Control Z. I'm gonna add a view model action and call that add new class 1. Class 1 create is the expression of that one. Refreshing the model, add new class 1, save it and open it. So this is the default rendering of the view, and it suffers from a couple of things. Let's see how we can, what we can do with this. If we turn on the grid lines, we see that this is a grid where things are placed. In this grid, suppose that we try to do it like this instead, that we moved these things up. We can remove this row, remove and let that go all the way to the bottom. If I save that and head back over here, I see that well, it won't fold or anything because everything is placed on a stable grid in the background. And that's actually the problem that we want to address. We want it to be able to adapt to how the screen size change. And this is of course true also for the web incarnation of this system. So I'm gonna start the web browser and bring in, and then this says that in order to show the web UI I must have a index view model. Okay, so I'm gonna add an index view model. Doesn't really need to have anything on it, it's just being rooted in a class, or not rooted but having a class association. I'm gonna leave that empty and refresh this, and now I see my action seek and create, and I can search on the object that I created in WPF, and the UI of course resembles the WPF, but here as well we see that the grid is sort of stable and doesn't really behave that good as the UI shrinks. So that's the main goal here, to find a way to make this behave better. And this is our solution, that on any view model you can add a placing container. So one placing container on the root, and a placing container is sort of a section that then may have subsections, and these sections are heavily influenced by the CSS layout system known as Flexbox HTML. So let's go ahead and see what happens. Add a placing container. So as we added a placing container, if I select the placing container, I can see in the preview in what direction things will render. So as I've started to use placing containers on this UI, all the columns really should belong to a placing container, because it's a bit undefined if you use placing containers but have the columns outside of them. And that's because there really is no rendering grid now. It's all based on this placing container. So a few new controls that we see over here that controls the design width. This will become important when we want to see how the UI folds. So as I said, we can add child placing containers to this, and we're gonna go ahead and do that immediately to show a point. So, and this one is up here. It really hasn't gotten much chance to do anything. What we want to do is to drag in some of the columns into this one. So I can do that like this. And we see that the columns that I drag in end up in sort of a row here. They're added after each other. And now I can see that if they were more of them, they would end up there. Let's add another child placing container under the first one, and add a few more of these. So where did that one go? It started after the first one. So this is not what we want. We want to have this row actually be a column instead, to have them on top of each other. So then we would choose the direction of the placing container to column. And once we do that, we see that the arrow points down, and we see the first child placing container row going this way and the other one going that way. So that's better, but maybe not what we want either. Let's turn this into a column as well. And then starting to be a bit more what we want. Let's do the other one. So now we can drag this, and we see that they are on top of each other like this. So what we probably wanted was a child container that was, let's move that one up, that was a row and held both of these columns. So I'm going to move these columns into the row. So if we're on the outermost column, we see that that covers the whole UI, and this row covers this bit. It has been expanded due to its content, which consists of 2 columns like this. So, but we still have this confusing bit down here. So I'm gonna add yet another child to this one, and move in these things. So, and currently all of my old UI is placed within one or exactly one placing container parent, and then I can see the background again. So if I point at this one, I can see that this is a row going that way, and it's owned by this one that is a row having these 1, 2, 3 things in it. Alright, so what we want to do first is probably have this grid part move out of this row and better be placed under those. So that would mean that this one should be under this one. So I simply drag and drop that one to here, and I'm going to move that one up. Yeah, that wasn't what I wanted. I'm going to move those out of, so I get, here is a row of the attributes, and down here is a row of the grid. Maybe I will do this one, this row, as a column instead, having it like that, because that's make more sense, and the buttons and header thing should go on top instead of so I'm going to move this one down. Something like that. So let's see what we can do with this. This column is, the direction is column. We have a visible expression that's then new, because these placing containers, as we call them, are new. So they both have a visible expression and a style expression. They also have a style for design, which is simply a string, so that we can see the effect of the style in design type. And then we have justify content and align content, and we're going to talk about all these properties throughout this video. But let's focus on one of these first. So this is a column holding a couple of the attributes that I want to show, and what I want to do with this is to sort of align all these well, maybe first we can talk about the complete row that holds these two columns. Now it justifies its content to start. If I were to put it to justify on end, one might get confused that this wasn't moved over here, but why? How come it isn't moved? Well, if we see that this arrow is rather short, it's just using this area here. So we need to look at its parent. So we can either go up to that parent that's over here and ask, how do you align your child elements, or align the child items. Currently that's not set. So what we probably want to do is to have it stretching the child elements. And what are the child elements? Well, it's basically this row and that column. So this row and that column. This row, if we go up to this and say that you should align the child elements to stretch, then these moved over here. And how come? Well, now the arrow for this row covers the whole area, and now it's these come into effect that we can see what happens when things grow and shrink like this. But another way to get this row to shrink, or rather to expand into the available area, is that we can see that the parent has stretch, but if we didn't want to set it on parent, we could override the parent's value to something else, and that's what self-align is for. So currently that's not set, and then the parent value is taken as the effective value. If we were to change this one back to start, we can see that the item that builds up this row moves to start, to end, but still it's just using this small area, and to center, so the small area in the middle. And as you can see, this will continue to stay in the middle even if the UI changes. But we probably want to do it as stretch, so we can use the whole area for this. And since we had stretch on the parent, I might as well have this as not set, then it will have the parent's value. Okay, so that's how the sort of row item is stretched. But how come these are still here in the end? That boils down to the justify content of the contents of this row. So let's look at this row, and the justify content is set to end. If I set that to start, everything is moved to here, and if I set it to center, it's moved to here. So this is a different kind of centering than the one that we had earlier, because on the other centering we were just getting the arrow was just, the box was just this area, but now the box is the complete area. And then we can do things like having the space between justification. So this might be silly when we just have 2 columns, but if we were to have 3 or more, it might be useful. And the space around is sort of exactly the same as space between, but we divide the distributable area and put some of it as front and back margins. So space around. So we get some area here and some area there and area over here. Right. So this is, I guess, one way of doing it, but we still want to address what we're gonna do about these small items, because it would be nicer if they use the space available to them. So then we're focusing on the column. So we have the same issue here. It's really so this column is really narrow, and this one is equally narrow, and we have a lot of space in between them. And to act on that, the logic says that we need to explain to these columns that they are allowed to grow into available space. And the way that is done is to state the grow factor compared to others. So this is a relative number that must be greater than 1 to have any effect. So greater than 1, like 2. Because what 2 means in this case is that it will grow twice as fast as the one that has 1 or less. So this one doesn't have any value in grow column. But if this one had 2 as well, and that area would also expand and they would share the space. As you see, these one are aligned to start, so that is an issue of the align items not being set on this column. So what I want to do on that is to stretch those. So now these are stretched in its column, and the column has a grow of 2. So this is the column for this one. If I were to set this column growth factor to 3, I can see that this will take up a bit more space than this one. So that's the way you control it, by the relative numbers. Like if you were to set 5 on this, even more space is grabbed from the available space. But if you go over here and set this to 5 as well, they have equal number and they will share the space. So it's just a relative number compared to the other ones in the same placing container. So we've been fiddling around a bit with this data. I'm going to save and refresh over here. You can now see that I have a different kind of behavior, not that different, but it's a bit different. What we probably want to do is to sort of have a minimum size on these columns to, when it gets really small, have all of these sort of wrap down and expand that way. So to achieve that, we need to explain to the outer placing container, in this case this row, that it's allowed to wrap. And we do that like this. You're allowed to wrap. And now as the width changes, still nothing happens because there's no actual need for it to force it to wrap. In order to create a need, we need to explain that these columns really should have a minimum width. So in order to explain to the system that we don't want this to go below a certain min width, we need to have a placing container that acts on row basis. So let's add a child placing container. Let's add 2 of them and say that they are rows. And then we move in the column into each of these rows, columns. So now we have the ability to say that this one, so we lost the setting that we put on this one, that it should grow, because now it's more like this one is the one that should grow, and this one is the one that should grow. So currently we have a row that stretches here, that consists of 1 row, and that goes from there to there, and 1 row that goes from there to there. Now we can say that this row should have a min width of, let's say, 300, and this one also must be 300. So now they will fight over those 300, and what will happen once they go below those 300 is that this UI is wrapped. So let's see what happens. So I can see that once this goes below, this whole section is moved down to here. And I can see that if I select this row, this arrow is now here and not here. And saving and refreshing the model. Let's see how it looks in HTML. So maybe I like it like this, or maybe not. Maybe I would like to have it like 3 columns instead, and then I would sort of just continue to do a row that has a column within it. So now we're over here, but since there's no data there, I can steal some of these, put those over there, and I'll steal some of these, put those over there. And since this one doesn't really have a grow on it, I always put this one on 5 as well. But it also doesn't have a line. So I'm going to set that to stretch, so that we're using the whole space in. So in order to move this placing container to make that fill its space in its owning row, I need to say that this is allowed to grow as well. So a value bigger than 1 will do, like 2. But now we see that this one is, even if we said that this row is allowed to take 5 relative coordinates, and this one is also 5. The issue here is that the min width is checked before, so that this is a hard criteria, and this has no min width on it. So if I were to say that this also should have 300, then we run into trouble immediately, because then we wrap the outer row directly. So this one is 300, this one is 300. This one then wraps into a new row, and since, let's see what happens now, because how come this takes all the space and not just some of the space? And that is depending on, since this is allowed to grow and there's really nothing stopping it from growing. To stop this from taking more than 300, we would also need to set that it has a max of 300. To make things show a bit more what it is that happens, one could add styling to the placing containers. That might be something that you want to do for your user as well, to be able to see how things progress. So to get styles going, we can define a style in the styles in model button that will be available various places in the UI. And we create the style, and let's call that one box. And the target for this style is a placing container primarily. So we can have multiple targets for each style, but in order to make it effective and have do any work on a placing container, it must contain the style target placing container. And I'm gonna add a color, so let's make it a light bluish tint, and it was called box. If I go on this column and set this one to box, I won't immediately see it because the styles aren't applied all the time. It's only when you open this one. So once you have it open, you should see the background. And now we see that it's sort of blue behind, but might be a bit tight, and this is where the margins come in handy. So let's say that this one has an upper margin of 10 and a right margin of 10. Well, let's put it on the right as well, or maybe just only on the right, and then we do the same for the other columns that gonna apply the same style. Now if we look at this in runtime, we see that we don't have the style applied because we only stated that this was a design time style. If we want to apply that style in runtime, we need to express it in the style expression. So since this is no logical rule, it's just the string box that we're gonna return. The expression for that is like this. And if we do that, let's copy this. Then we should see the styles here, and we don't, so I'm gonna restart this one. And we still don't see it, so I think this is sort of an issue with the style itself. For the box, for the placing container, I could put the margin on the style itself to make it so that it shows outside of the box and not just behind the box. So that's a bit of the explanations that's needed for the root level here to get things going, to have a flexible UI. But what about this lower part, the grid part? There are different ways to go. Currently we have the grid, like a data grid, placed within this column. Let's use the design style for this as well to see how it looks, where it goes, and make that in runtime as well, if you can spell it right. And if there's data here, that will grow like that. And of course we could have made this a part of this upper row to really, if we have a really large screen, sort of make this one pop up on over here, but that wouldn't be very constructive. It's just a possibility, technical possibility. So this is one way of sort of going halfway on the responsiveness. This grid will still not be responsive because the columns will take up their space, and there's really not much we can do to have this fold in any controllable way. So what we can do is use the placing containers on this level as well. And let's see how one would go about that. The first thing for sort of nestings that are many rows, like grids, is that we need 2 placing containers at least. So I'm gonna first add a placing container, which is the holder for all of the data, and then a child placing container, which is the holder of one row within the data. So the first one is probably a column. We want it to grow in this direction. I'm going to change that to a column. And the second one, which could be a row, should then have the relevant values, columns. And it's the same thing here. It's a bit undefined if you leave columns outside of placing containers once you start using them. And what the designer does is add 3 bogus empty rows to show you how this will behave. And you can use these buttons to see how this behaves. So still, these are now editable boxes, but we might not want that. I can delete this one. Might want them to be static, and then we would change that like this, of course. And since these are now usual controls that normally show up on root level or a single level, we can do all the things that we can do with those now in the list view. So let's see what happens, how that looks in runtime. So here the data will show up like this. And of course, this still isn't responsive in the way that we want, because it's just pressing it together, and that goes back to this row not being wrappable. But if it was, if we were allowed to wrap this row, then this would happen. So let's see. Yeah, so now these folds down. So that's more responsive to be able to do things, to fit data into any form factor. So how come this doesn't go any further? Well, it's because we have the limitation on some of the elements as max width, I guess. And same for WPF. For list views like this, there's no limitation, of course. You can have multiple child containers, and maybe you want to do something like this. Let's add 2 child containers, make this one a column as well, and move some of the attributes into first row and some into the second row. And let's remove some of these too. What you have now is a UI that would, let's do it wider and have higher width and make it fit the available space. It's a multi-line UI like this. So if we save that, and refresh this one. So we have for each row or each item we have 2 rows, and that would come in handy if we were to hide one of the rows and only show it if it's highlighted or selected. Let's say that we add an action over here. It's gonna add a new column, an action column, and move that up into this row. So we have a button in this row, and in that button we're gonna say that this is named class 2s. So there's a recurrent variable that's named class 2s, and that current variable can assign the value of self, because the button is in the context of the row that you click it. So that means that this one will be the selected one. And suppose that we put the visible expression of this whole row, or rather the lower row, to this one being equal to self. If it's equal to self, we should show this row. On the other hand, if it's not equal to self, we should hide the upper row. And then we would have this effect that we only show one of the rows until we click the action column, then we show the other row. Then we could go like this to have one of them selected. And if, let's say that the first row being static, all the fields being static, so that they are not editable, and the other one, they are all editable, we could get the effect. Let's see, let's change this. So this one is attribute 1, and one edit, and this other one was attribute 10. So we call this 10 edit. Yeah, and I forgot to remove the read-only expression that defaults to true in grids. So this way I can type text here, and that will end up as shown static text once we're not selected. And that makes it possible to do quite advanced editable things, like maybe this one that you have for edit shouldn't at all be well, maybe it should be a column instead. So when you go to this one, you can write things like this. And this is of course the same for WPF. So if you push one, you can do stuff here. And once you push the next one, and in WPF it's actually the row that catches the selection. It's a bit different. I'm not sure that we're gonna keep it like that, but that's the way it is now. This button is way too big, and the new margin things are an okay way to address that. So if we have this this button over here, and we say that it should, or really not the margins, the min and max. So if we select this button and say that the max value of this one, as it's in a column, no, it's in a row, then max will be in this direction. So that's okay. Let's just make it 30. Well, not the whole column, I meant only the action button. Sorry, wrong button. And if you want an image or something on this one, you would only do a rendered by or something like that. So to keep this video on the not too extremely long side, I will wrap it up here, but what we have shown is most of the functionality available for doing still very declarative UIs, but introducing a bit new information that we call placing containers, that builds up groups of hierarchies of stuff that will then be able to be responsibly folded the way that you can use to make the UI work on many form factors. Thank you for listening.